The dust swirled in angry clouds as the last wagon disappeared over the horizon, leaving nothing but emptiness and the bitter taste of betrayal on Margaret Porter's tongue. Her younger sister, Hannah's sobs cut through the eerie silence of the vast Utah wilderness, the setting sun painting the towering red rocks of the landscape with a bloody glow that matched the desperation in Margaret's heart. The year was 1874, and being abandoned in the middle of nowhere could very well be a death sentence for two city-bred women from Boston. "They left us," Hannah whispered, her voice cracking. "They actually left us, Maggie." Margaret squeezed her sister's hand, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. At 23, she'd appointed herself her 19-year-old sister's protector since their parents' deaths the previous winter. That responsibility now seemed impossibly heavy as they stood alone on the trail to St. George, miles from civilization. "They'll realize we're missing," Margaret said, though she didn't believe it. Wagon Master Jenkins had made it clear that morning. Anyone not ready at first light would be left behind. They'd overslept after staying up late caring for Mrs. Holloway's sick baby, and by the time they'd gathered their belongings, the train was already pulling away. Their frantic chase had ended with Hannah twisting her ankle badly in a prairie dog hole. By then, the wagons were distant smudges on the horizon, their shouts unheard over the rumble of wheels and hoofbeats. "What do we do now?" Hannah asked, sinking to the ground, her face pale beneath her bonnet. Margaret looked around at their meager possessions, one trunk hastily salvaged before their pursuit, containing clothes, a few personal items, and barely any food or water. The brutal reality of their situation struck her with full force. Two Eastern women alone in the wild territory with no survival skills and limited supplies. "We need to find shelter for the night," Margaret decided, squinting at the deepening shadows. "Then tomorrow we can." A distant sound interrupted her hoofbeats, growing steadily louder. Margaret's heart leaped. Someone had come back for them after all. Then fear replaced hope. This was dangerous country. Indians, outlaws, wild animals, any could spell their doom. "Quick, Hannah," she whispered urgently, "behind those rocks." They hadn't made it 3 steps when a lone rider crested the rise, silhouetted against the crimson sky. Margaret pushed Hannah behind her. Reaching for the small Derringer pistol, their father had insisted they bring a lady's gun that might scare off a snake, but would do little against a determined attacker. The rider approached at a steady canter, and as he drew nearer, Margaret could make out his features. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. A cowboy, by the look of him, with a bandana around his neck and leather chaps over his denim trousers. He reined his horse to a stop a respectful distance away, raising one hand in greeting. "Miss Porter," he called. "Miss Hannah Porter." Margaret kept the Derringer half hidden in the folds of her skirt. "Who's asking?" The man removed his hat, revealing a shock of sandy hair and a face tanned by years under the sun. His eyes, a startling blue, assessed them with concern but no malice she could detect. "Name's Henry Thornton, madam," he said, his voice carrying a soft western drawl. "I ride for the Silver Creek Ranch near St. George. Jenkins sent me back when they counted heads and found you missing." Relief flooded through Margaret, though she maintained her wary stance. "Wagon Master Jenkins sent you, the same man who said he wouldn't wait for stragglers." A smile touched the corner of Henry's mouth. The very same, though it might have been more the Reverend Wilson's sermon about Christian charity that did the convincing. He dismounted smoothly, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "Are you both all right? Are you hurt?" Hannah stepped forward, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. "I fell," she admitted. "That's why we couldn't catch up." Henry nodded, his expression serious. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward Hannah's ankle. After receiving Margaret's tense nod, he knelt and gently examined the swollen joint. "Not broken, I don't think, but a bad sprain. You won't be walking on it for a while." He straightened and looked at the darkening sky. The wagon trains made camp about 8 miles ahead, but with your sister's injury and nightfall coming on, catching up tonight would be difficult. "What do you suggest, Mr. Thornton?" Margaret asked, finally tucking away the derringer, deciding that if he meant them harm, he'd had ample opportunity. Henry looked between them, his expression thoughtful. "I've got a proposition for you ladies. My ranch is closer than the wagon train, about 5 miles east of here. You could rest there tonight, and I can take you to rejoin your party tomorrow." Hannah glanced hopefully at Margaret. The idea of a proper roof and perhaps a real bed after weeks on the trail was tempting, but Margaret hesitated. "It wouldn't be proper," she began, though the alternative, spending the night exposed to the elements and whatever dangers lurked in the wilderness, seemed far worse. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Gunderson, is at the ranch," Henry added, as if reading her thoughts. "Everything would be entirely proper, I assure you. She's Norwegian, tough as nails, and would tan my hide if I suggested otherwise." The image of a formidable Norse woman standing guard over their virtue brought a reluctant smile to Margaret's lips. "I suppose we don't have much choice." "You always have a choice, Miss Porter," Henry said seriously, "but I'm offering the safest one available right now." Margaret looked at her sister's pale face and swollen ankle, then at their single trunk of belongings, and finally at the rapidly darkening sky. "Very well, Mr. Thornton. We accept your offer." "Good," he nodded, relief evident in his expression. "Now let's get you both situated," he whistled, and his horse obediently stepped forward. "This is Thunder, he's steady as they come." With surprising gentleness for such a big man, Henry helped Hannah into the saddle, then secured their trunk to the back with leather straps from his saddlebag. "Miss Porter," he said, turning to Margaret, "I'm afraid we'll have to share the walk." Margaret nodded, gathering her skirts. "I've been walking alongside wagons for weeks, Mr. Thornton. A few more miles won't kill me." Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. "I don't doubt your stamina, madam, but if you get tired, just say the word." They set off eastward, Henry leading Thunder by the reins with one hand while carrying a rifle in the other. Margaret walked beside him, her eyes constantly scanning the unfamiliar terrain. "How long have you been in the territory?" she asked after several minutes of silence, partly from genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from her aching feet. "Going on 8 years now," Henry replied. "Came west after the war between the states. Worked as a ranch hand for a spell, then saved enough to start my own place." "You fought in the war?" Hannah asked from atop the horse. Henry nodded, his expression momentarily distant. "Union cavalry, wasn't much older than you when I enlisted." Margaret studied him with new interest. He couldn't be more than 30, she realized, though the lines around his eyes had initially made her place him as older. "And now you have your own ranch," Silver Creek Ranch, he confirmed, a note of pride entering his voice. "It's modest compared to some, but it's mine. Good water, decent grazing land. I run about 200 head of cattle." "That sounds substantial to me," Margaret said. "Our father was a banker in Boston. I'm afraid I don't know much about ranching." "Banking's a good, steady profession," Henry remarked. "What brings you ladies out to Utah territory, if you don't mind my asking?" Margaret and Hannah exchanged a glance, a familiar pain passing between them. "Our parents died last winter," Margaret explained quietly. "Influenza. They left us the house and some savings, but father's banking partner." She trailed off, the betrayal still raw. "Let's just say we found ourselves with far less than we expected. Our cousin Charlotte married and moved to St. George 2 years ago. She wrote that the town is growing, that they need teachers for their school." "Both of you are teachers?" Henry asked. Hannah shook her head. "Just Maggie. I was studying to be one, but Hannah is quite talented with a needle," Margaret interrupted. "She's hoping to find work as a seamstress." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "St. George could use both. It's growing fast since the Mormon temple construction began. Lots of families settling there." They continued walking as the last light faded from the sky, stars appearing in breathtaking profusion overhead. Margaret had never seen so many stars in Boston, where city lights and coal smoke obscured all but the brightest. Out here, the Milky Way stretched across the heavens like spilled sugar. "It's beautiful," she murmured, almost to herself. "That it is," Henry agreed, his voice soft. "It's one of the things that keeps me here despite the hardships, the sky at night, the mountains at dawn." They have a way of making a man feel both insignificant and important all at once. The poeticism of his words surprised her. This cowboy was more than he appeared at first glance. After nearly 2 hours of walking, with only a brief rest midway, Henry pointed ahead. There it is. Silver Creek Ranch. Margaret peered into the darkness and could just make out the silhouette of buildings against the starlit sky. As they drew closer, she saw a modest but well-built ranch house, a large barn, and several smaller outbuildings. A warm light glowed from one of the windows, and smoke curled from the chimney. Before they reached the yard, the front door opened, and a sturdy woman with silver-streaked blonde hair pulled into a tight bun stood silhouetted in the doorway, a shotgun resting casually in her arms. "That you, Henry Thornton?" she called, her accent thick and distinctly Scandinavian. "It's me, Mrs. Gunderson," Henry called back. "I've brought guests." The woman lowered the shotgun but didn't put it away. "Guests at this hour." As they entered the circle of light spilling from the open door, Mrs. Gunderson's eyes widened at the sight of Margaret and Hannah. "Good heavens, women, Henry Thornton, what have you done now?" Henry explained the situation as he helped Hannah down from the horse. Mrs. Gunderson's initial suspicion quickly transformed into motherly concern. "You poor dears, left behind by that dreadful wagon train. Come inside, come inside. I'll heat water for baths and make up the spare room." "I don't want to put you to any trouble," Margaret began, but Mrs. Gunderson waved her protests away. "Nonsense, no trouble at all. It's not often we have female company at Silver Creek." She shot Henry a meaningful look. "About time, too." Henry cleared his throat. "I'll see to thunder and bring in your trunk, ladies. Mrs. Gunderson will take good care of you." True to her word, the housekeeper soon had them settled in a cozy bedroom with clean linens and a basin of warm water for washing. She brought them bowls of hearty beef stew with fresh bread and a pot of strong tea, clucking over Hannah's swollen ankle and wrapping it in cloths soaked in a pungent herbal solution. "Arnica and comfrey," she explained. "Bring the swelling down by morning, you'll see." After ensuring they had everything they needed, Mrs. Gunderson bid them good night, closing the door firmly behind her. Margaret could hear her speaking sternly to Henry in the hallway, though the words were indistinct. "I like her," Hannah said, sinking back against the pillows with a sigh of contentment. "And Mr. Thornton seems nice, too." Margaret nodded noncommittally as she unpinned her hair. "He was kind to come back for us." "More than kind," Hannah pointed out. "He didn't have to do that, especially since the wagon master was ready to leave us behind." "I suppose not," Margaret admitted. She thought of the way Henry had walked beside her, matching his long stride to hers, how he'd steadied her with a gentle hand when she stumbled over unseen rocks in the darkness. There was something reassuring about his presence, solid, dependable. "He's handsome too," Hannah added with a mischievous smile. "Those blue eyes." "Hannah Porter, we've only just met the man," Margaret scolded, though she couldn't disagree. There was something compelling about Henry Thornton's weathered face and direct gaze. "I'm just saying," Hannah yawned, "that Cousin Charlotte might not be the only reason to stay in St. George." Margaret threw a pillow at her sister, and they both dissolved into giggles, the strain of their harrowing day finally releasing. As they settled into the first real bed they'd had in weeks, Margaret found herself wondering what the morning would bring, and whether they would indeed be rejoining the wagon train as planned. When Margaret woke the next morning, sunlight was already streaming through the small window. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was. The softness of the mattress beneath her and the clean smell of the sheets were a stark contrast to the hard ground and musty wagon canvas she'd grown accustomed to. Hannah was still sleeping soundly beside her, her breathing deep and even. Margaret slipped quietly from the bed, careful not to disturb her sister. She washed her face in the basin of now cool water and did her best to make herself presentable, pinning up her chestnut hair and straightening her travel-worn dress. When she opened the bedroom door, delicious smells greeted her: coffee, bacon, and something sweet baking in the oven. Following her nose, she found the kitchen, where Mrs. Gunderson was bustling between the stove and a worn wooden table. "Good morning, Miss Porter." The housekeeper greeted cheerfully. Sleep well, did you? Better than I have in weeks, Margaret admitted. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Gunderson. Sit, sit, the older woman insisted, pulling out a chair. You need a proper breakfast after your ordeal. She poured a cup of coffee and placed it in front of Margaret. Henry's been up since before dawn, seeing to the chores. He'll be in shortly. As if summoned by her words, the back door opened and Henry entered, carrying a pail of fresh milk. He'd shaved, Margaret noted, and changed into a clean shirt, though his boots and denim still bore the dust of ranch work. "Good morning, Miss Porter," he said, removing his hat. "I trust you slept well." "Very well, thank you," she replied, suddenly conscious of her wrinkled dress and travel-worn appearance. "And please call me Margaret. After you rescued us, I think we can dispense with some formalities." A smile warmed his eyes. "Margaret, then, and I'm Henry." He set the milk pail on the counter for Mrs. Gunderson. "How is your sister this morning? Still sleeping? I thought it best not to wake her yet." "Her ankle, I checked on it when I brought in fresh water," Mrs. Gunderson interrupted, setting a plate of eggs, bacon, and biscuits before Margaret. "The swelling's down considerably. My herbs never fail." Henry poured himself a cup of coffee and joined Margaret at the table. "I've been thinking about your situation," he said after a moment. "The wagon train will be moving on this morning. If we leave within the hour, we might catch them before they break camp." Margaret nodded, though she felt a strange reluctance at the thought of rejoining the wagon train that had so easily left them behind. "Yes, I suppose we should hurry." Henry seemed to hesitate. "There is another option." "If you're amenable." Margaret looked up from her plate. "What sort of option? St. George is only a day's ride from here. I could take you directly there in my buckboard wagon, bypassing the need to rejoin the train altogether. With your sister's injury, it might be more comfortable for her." Margaret considered this. The wagon train would take at least 3 more days to reach St. George, following its circuitous route to accommodate all the heavy wagons. A direct journey would be faster and more comfortable, especially for Hannah. "That's very generous," she said slowly, "but I wouldn't want to impose further on your kindness. You've already done so much." "It's no imposition," Henry assured her. "I need to go into town anyway for supplies. And to be frank, I don't much care for Wagon Master Jenkins and his casual attitude toward leaving 2 women stranded in the wilderness." There was a protective edge to his voice that sent an unexpected warmth through Margaret's chest. "What do you think, Mrs. Gunderson?" she asked, turning to the housekeeper, who was pretending not to listen as she kneaded dough at the counter. "I think it's a fine idea," Mrs. Gunderson said firmly. "That ankle needs proper rest, not jostling in a covered wagon for 3 more days. Besides, I've packed enough food for the journey." She gestured to a basket already sitting on the sideboard, covered with a checkered cloth. Margaret couldn't help smiling. "You seem to have decided for us already." "Norwegian efficiency," Mrs. Gunderson replied with a wink. "Now eat your breakfast, you'll need your strength." By the time Hannah woke and joined them, the decision had been made. Henry would take them directly to St. George, where their cousin Charlotte was expecting them. Hannah was delighted with the plan, especially when she tested her ankle and found it much improved but still too tender for prolonged walking. While Henry prepared the buckboard wagon, adding a layer of straw and blankets for comfort, Margaret and Hannah repacked their trunk. Mrs. Gunderson insisted on adding a jar of her herbal salve for Hannah's ankle and a loaf of freshly baked bread for your cousin. As they prepared to depart, Margaret found herself drawn to the view from the front porch of the ranch house. Silver Creek Ranch sat in a small valley, surrounded by rolling grasslands that gave way to red rock formations in the distance. A clear stream, the Silver Creek that gave the ranch its name, wound its way through the property, bordered by cottonwood trees that rustled gently in the morning breeze. "It's beautiful here," she said as Henry joined her on the porch. "It is," he agreed, his voice carrying a note of pride. "Took me years to find the right piece of land. The moment I saw this valley, I knew this was it." He paused, looking out over his domain. "Most folks heading west want gold or silver. All I ever wanted was good land and the freedom to work it my own way." Margaret studied his profile, struck by the contentment in his expression. "You've built something remarkable here," He turned to her, surprise evident in his face. Most Eastern folks think this is primitive living, no theaters, no fancy shops. There's a different kind of wealth here, Margaret replied thoughtfully. Space to breathe, room to grow. In Boston, we were surrounded by people but often felt alone. Something shifted in Henry's eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of a kindred spirit. But the moment was broken when Hannah hobbled onto the porch, supported by Mrs. Gunderson. "We're ready when you are," she announced cheerfully. The journey to St. George began under clear blue skies. Henry had made the buckboard as comfortable as possible, with the straw-filled blankets forming a soft seat and a canvas awning providing shade. Hannah sat in the middle, her injured ankle propped on a small cushion Mrs. Gunderson had insisted they take. Margaret sat to her right, with Henry handling the reins on the left. The two draft horses pulling the wagon set a steady pace, gentle enough not to jostle Hannah's ankle unduly, but quick enough to make good time. Henry explained they would follow the creek for several miles before turning onto the main road to St. George. "Will we reach town by nightfall?" Margaret asked, adjusting her bonnet against the sun. "If all goes well," Henry confirmed. "Though we'll stop to rest the horses midday. There's a good spot about halfway with shade and water." As they traveled, Henry pointed out features of the landscape and shared stories about the territory. He knew the history of the region well, from the native Paiute tribes who had first inhabited it to the Mormon settlers who had established St. George as part of Brigham Young's Cotton Mission in the 1860s. "They're trying to make the desert bloom," he explained. "Irrigation ditches, fruit orchards, cotton fields, ambitious work in this harsh climate." "And you," Margaret asked, "are you part of their community?" Henry shook his head. "I respect their industry, but no, I'm not Mormon. Out here, though, neighbors help neighbors regardless of faith. When my barn caught fire 2 years back after a lightning strike, half the Mormon farmers from miles around came to help rebuild it." "That's encouraging to hear," Margaret said. "In Boston, the different congregations barely acknowledge one another." "Frontier living has a way of stripping away such divisions," Henry remarked. "When survival depends on cooperation, you learn to look past differences pretty quick." As the morning progressed, the temperature rose steadily. By midday, the heat was considerable, and Margaret was grateful when Henry guided the wagon into a grove of cottonwood trees beside a small spring. The shade was immediate relief, the temperature dropping several degrees beneath the broad leaves. "Perfect timing," Hannah sighed, fanning herself with her hand. "I was beginning to think we might melt." Henry helped them down from the wagon, his hand lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary on Margaret's waist as he lifted her to the ground. The brief contact sent an unexpected flutter through her stomach. While Henry unhitched the horses to let them drink and graze, Margaret and Hannah spread a blanket in the shade and unpacked the lunch misses. Gunderson had prepared cold fried chicken, bread, cheese, and apples with a jug of cool cider. "Join us, Henry," Hannah called as he finished with the horses. "There's plenty for all." He hesitated only briefly before sitting down on the edge of the blanket, careful to maintain a respectful distance. As they ate, the conversation flowed easily, ranging from Hannah's plans to establish herself as a seamstress to Margaret's hopes for teaching. "Charlotte wrote that the school is still quite small," Margaret explained. "Just one room with children of all ages, but that's how I started teaching in Boston as an assistant in a similar arrangement." "The town council's been talking about building a proper schoolhouse," Henry said. "They've set aside land for it already. The children have been meeting in the back of the general store meanwhile." "You seem to know St. George well," Hannah observed. Henry nodded. "I go in for supplies every few weeks, and I serve on the County Livestock Commission. It brings me to town regularly for meetings." Margaret found herself wondering if his frequent visits might mean their paths would continue to cross after they reached their destination. The thought was surprisingly pleasing. After lunch, they rested for another hour in the shade, allowing the horses to recuperate and the worst of the midday heat to pass. Hannah dozed off, her head pillowed on their folded shawls, while Margaret and Henry sat in companionable silence by the spring. "May I ask you something personal, Henry?" Margaret ventured after a time. You can ask, he replied with a slight smile. I might not answer. Fair enough, she acknowledged. I was wondering why a man who clearly values home and stability as much as you do hasn't started a family of his own. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was quiet for so long that Margaret began to regret her boldness. I'm sorry, she said quickly. That was too forward of me. No, Henry shook his head. It's a fair question. He picked up a small stone and rolled it between his fingers thoughtfully. The truth is, I was engaged once back in Illinois after the war. Her name was Catherine. We were planning the wedding when she took sick with scarlet fever. His voice grew distant. She was gone in less than a week. I'm so sorry, Margaret said softly, instinctively reaching out to touch his arm. It was a long time ago now, Henry said, though the shadow in his eyes suggested the pain remained. Afterward, I couldn't bear to stay in that town with all those memories. So I headed west, worked my way across the country until I found this place. He looked up at the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. As for why I haven't started a family since then, I suppose I just never met a woman who made me want to risk that kind of loss again. The vulnerability in his admission touched something deep in Margaret's heart. She understood all too well the fear of further loss after experiencing such profound grief. I think, she said carefully, that's why Hannah and I decided to come west, though we didn't articulate it that way. Boston had become a city of ghosts for us. Henry's gaze met hers, a current of understanding passing between them. And now, are you afraid still? Margaret considered the question. Less than I was, she admitted. Each day puts a little more distance between us and the pain. Sometimes I feel guilty about that, about healing. Catherine once told me something I've never forgotten, Henry said. She said joy isn't a betrayal of grief, it's a tribute to those we've lost. To live well is to honor their memory. Your Catherine sounds like she was very wise, Margaret said softly. She was, Henry agreed. I think she would approve of this, of my helping you and your sister find your new beginning. Before Margaret could respond, Hannah stirred and sat up, yawning. Oh, did I fall asleep? What time is it? The moment between Margaret and Henry dissolved, but something had shifted. A connection formed through shared understanding of loss and the tentative hope of renewal. They resumed their journey as the afternoon heat began to wane. The landscape gradually changed as they approached St. George, the isolated ranch lands giving way to scattered farms and orchards. Signs of civilization became more frequent, fenced fields, irrigation ditches, and occasionally other travelers on the road. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, they crested a small rise and St. George came into view in the valley below a neat grid of streets surrounded by red rock formations, with the partly constructed Mormon temple rising white and imposing from the center of town. There it is, Henry announced. St. George, population about 1,200 now and growing steadily. From their elevated position, Margaret could see the entire town laid out before them, modest in size compared to Boston, but orderly and substantial. She felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. This would be their new home, the place where they would rebuild their lives. It's larger than I expected, Hannah remarked, leaning forward eagerly. Your cousin's house, do you know where it is? Henry asked as he guided the wagon down the slope toward town. Margaret pulled a folded letter from her reticule. Charlotte wrote that they live on Mulberry Street near the corner of 2nd West. Her husband, James Miller, is a carpenter who works on the temple construction. Henry nodded. I know the area. We'll head there directly. As they entered the town proper, Margaret was struck by how new everything looked. Unlike Boston's centuries-old buildings, St. George had been established barely a decade earlier. The streets were wide and straight, lined with young trees that provided scant shade. Many buildings were constructed of the same red sandstone as the surrounding cliffs, giving the town a distinctive appearance. People stopped to watch as their wagon passed, some nodding greetings to Henry. A few curious glances were directed at Margaret and Hannah. New faces were evidently still noteworthy in this frontier community. Main Street, Henry announced as they turned onto a broad thoroughfare lined with businesses. He pointed out landmarks as they passed. The general store, the telegraph office, the small hotel, and the Tabernacle building with its white tower. Finally, they turned onto Mulberry Street, a residential avenue with modest homes set back from the road, many with small gardens or orchards attached. About halfway down the block, Henry pulled the wagon to a stop in front of a neat whitewashed house with green shutters and a covered porch. "This should be it," he said, setting the brake and wrapping the reins around the handle. Margaret felt a sudden nervousness. They hadn't seen Charlotte in over 2 years, and their last meeting had been at their parents' funeral. What if their cousin had changed her mind about welcoming them? What if they were imposing too much? As if sensing her anxiety, Henry touched her hand lightly. "It'll be all right," he said quietly. "St. George folks are good people." Before Margaret could respond, the front door of the house opened, and a woman in her early 30s hurried out, her face lighting with recognition. "Margaret, Hannah, is that really you?" Charlotte Miller called, rushing down the path to the gate. She was slimmer than Margaret remembered, her once round face tanned by the desert sun, but her warm smile was unchanged. "Charlotte," Hannah exclaimed, her earlier fatigue forgotten as she attempted to stand in the wagon. Henry quickly jumped down and came around to help her, supporting her weight as she climbed down carefully. Margaret followed, and within moments, the sisters were engulfed in Charlotte's enthusiastic embrace. "Look at you both. Oh, I've been so worried, wondering if you'd made it safely," Charlotte exclaimed, pulling back to examine them. "When the telegraph came saying the wagon train was a day away, I was beside myself with excitement, and now you're here early. However did you manage it?" Margaret glanced at Henry, who stood respectfully to the side. "We had some unexpected help." "Charlotte, this is Mr. Henry Thornton. He owns Silver Creek Ranch outside of town. There was a misunderstanding with the wagon train, and Mr. Thornton very kindly brought us the rest of the way." Charlotte's eyes widened slightly as she took in Henry's tall figure, but her welcoming smile never faltered. "Mr. Thornton, how can I ever thank you for delivering my cousins safely?" Henry tipped his hat. "No thanks necessary, Mrs. Miller. It was my pleasure." "Nonsense. You must stay for supper. James will be home from the temple site soon, and he'd want to thank you properly as well." Henry hesitated, looking toward the sun, which was now low in the sky. "That's very kind, but I should probably start back if I want to make any progress before dark." "Start back tonight," Charlotte exclaimed. "Surely not, it's nearly evening already." "I've made the ride in darkness before," Henry said, though Margaret detected a note of reluctance in his voice. "Please stay," Margaret found herself saying, "at least for supper. After all you've done for us, it seems wrong to send you away hungry." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a mutual awareness that their journey together was ending too soon. After a moment, Henry nodded. "All right, thank you, I accept," Charlotte beamed. "Excellent. Now let's get you all inside and settled. James can help with your trunk when he returns." As they walked up the path to the house, Hannah leaning on Charlotte's arm while Margaret fell into step beside Henry, Margaret felt a complex mix of emotions. They had reached their destination safely, found Charlotte's welcome as warm as they'd hoped, and yet there was a wistfulness in knowing that Henry would soon ride away, back to his ranch and his life. She stole a glance at his profile and found him already looking at her, a similar conflict reflected in his eyes. Charlotte's home proved to be as neat inside as out, modest but comfortable, with handcrafted furniture that spoke to her husband's skill as a carpenter. She showed the sisters to a small bedroom they would share, apologizing for the cramped quarters. "It's only temporary," Charlotte assured them. "James has already started building us a larger home closer to the center of town. It will have 2 proper guest rooms." "This is perfect," Margaret insisted, genuinely touched by her cousin's thoughtfulness. The room was small but charming, with a single bed that would be tight for 2 but manageable, fresh curtains at the window, and a washstand with a china basin and pitcher. While Hannah rested her ankle on the bed, Margaret helped Charlotte in the kitchen, with Henry offering to tend to the horses and wagon. Through the window, Margaret watched him care for the animals with practiced efficiency, removing their harnesses and rubbing them down with handfuls of straw. "He seems like a good man," Charlotte remarked, following Margaret's gaze as she kneaded dough for biscuits. He is, Margaret agreed simply, turning her attention back to slicing vegetables. We owe him a great deal. Charlotte gave her a shrewd look but didn't press further. James says Mr. Thornton is well respected in the county. His cattle are some of the finest in the territory, apparently. Before long, James Miller arrived home, a stocky, bearded man with kind eyes and calloused hands who welcomed his wife's cousins with genuine warmth. He insisted on retrieving their trunk from the wagon himself, brushing aside Henry's offer of help with good-natured stubbornness. "You've done enough bringing these ladies safely to us," he declared. "The least I can do is haul a trunk." Supper was a lively affair, with Charlotte's hearty stew, fresh biscuits, and preserved peaches from her garden. The conversation flowed easily as James shared news of the temple construction. Charlotte inquired about mutual acquaintances back east, and Hannah described some of their more memorable experiences on the wagon train. Throughout the meal, Margaret was acutely aware of Henry across the table. He spoke little but listened attentively, occasionally contributing a comment or answering a question about his ranch. Once, their hands accidentally touched when reaching for the biscuit plate at the same time, and Margaret felt a now familiar flutter in her stomach at the brief contact. As the meal concluded and Charlotte began clearing the dishes, James leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Thornton, I can't in good conscience let you start back to your ranch tonight. It's full dark already, and those roads can be treacherous even in daylight." Henry began to protest, but James held up a hand. "I insist. We have a perfectly good sofa in the parlor, and you can get a fresh start at dawn." Margaret felt a rush of relief at the thought of Henry not risking the dark journey, followed immediately by awareness that his continued presence would only make their eventual parting more difficult. After some polite resistance, Henry finally acquiesced to James's insistence. "You're very kind." "I accept with gratitude." Later, as the women washed dishes in the kitchen while the men smoked pipes on the front porch, Charlotte nudged Margaret gently. "So, Henry Thornton," Margaret concentrated on drying a plate. "What about him? Don't play coy with me, Margaret Porter." "I saw how you look at him and how he looks at you when he thinks no one's watching." "Charlotte, I barely know the man," Margaret protested, though she could feel her cheeks warming. Hannah, who was sitting at the kitchen table with her ankle propped on a stool, laughed softly. "She's been like this since he rescued us, Charlotte, pretending there's nothing there when anyone with eyes can see otherwise." "Traitor," Margaret muttered, shooting her sister a mock glare. Charlotte smiled knowingly. "Well, I think it's wonderful. He seems like a fine man, established, respected, and not hard on the eyes either." "None of that matters," Margaret said firmly, though her heart wasn't in the denial. "He'll be gone tomorrow and we'll be starting our new lives here." "Saint George isn't so large that your paths won't cross again," Charlotte pointed out, "especially if you're teaching at the school. Henry Thornton serves on several town committees, according to James." The thought sent a pleasant warmth through Margaret's chest, but she tamped it down. "We'll see," was all she would commit to saying. When the dishes were finished, they joined the men on the porch, where James was describing the temple's construction in detail to a politely interested Henry. The night was cool and clear, the stars even more brilliant here than they had been at the ranch. "It's getting late," Charlotte eventually said, stifling a yawn. "We should all get some rest. It's been a long day." As the others filed inside, Henry touched Margaret's elbow lightly, detaining her on the porch. "Could I have a word before you retire?" Her pulse quickening, Margaret nodded. "Of course." They stood together at the porch railing, the night sounds of crickets and distant coyotes filling the silence between them. Finally, Henry spoke. "I wanted to say, that is, I hope," he paused, uncharacteristically uncertain. "I hope that your new beginning here is everything you wish for." "Thank you," Margaret said softly. "That's very kind." Henry turned to face her, his expression earnest in the faint light spilling from the house windows. "I also wanted to say that if you or your sister ever need anything at all, you can send word to Silver Creek. I'm in town every other Thursday for the Livestock Commission meeting." Margaret smiled, touched by his concern. "I'll remember that, And thank you again, Henry, for everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come back for us." "I'm glad it was me," he said simply. Then, after a brief hesitation, "Margaret, I hope I'll see you again." The vulnerability in his voice made her heart skip. "I'd like that," she admitted. For a moment, it seemed he might say more or perhaps even take her hand, but the front door opened, spilling more light onto the porch. "Margaret," Charlotte called, "is everything all right?" The moment broken, Margaret stepped back slightly. "Yes, coming," she called over her shoulder, then turned back to Henry. "Good night, Henry, sleep well." "Good night, Margaret," he replied softly. As she followed Charlotte inside, Margaret couldn't help glancing back. Henry stood silhouetted against the starry sky, watching her go, and she felt a certainty settle in her heart that this wasn't an ending, but a beginning. True to his word, Henry departed at dawn the next morning, leaving before Margaret and Hannah had risen. Charlotte reported that he'd left a brief note thanking them for their hospitality and wishing the Porter sisters well in their new home. Margaret tried to hide her disappointment at missing the chance to say a proper goodbye, but Charlotte, ever perceptive, squeezed her hand knowingly. "Don't worry, St. George is a small town. You'll see him again soon enough." The next weeks passed in a flurry of activity as Margaret and Hannah settled into their new lives. Charlotte and James proved to be invaluable guides, introducing them to key members of the community and helping them navigate the customs and expectations of frontier society. Margaret secured the teaching position at the town school, which indeed operated from the back room of Jensen's General Store. Her 20 students, ranging in age from 5 to 16, were a mix of Mormon and non-Mormon children, all eager to learn despite the cramped conditions and limited supplies. Hannah, meanwhile, quickly established herself as a skilled seamstress, initially working from Charlotte's home before renting a small front room on Main Street for her business. Her Eastern training and refined techniques were greatly appreciated by the local women, who had previously relied on less skilled local seamstresses or ordered garments from Salt Lake City at considerable expense. As the sisters became more established, they began searching for a place of their own. Though Charlotte and James insisted they were welcome to stay as long as they wished, both Margaret and Hannah felt it was time to stand on their own feet again. Mrs. Peterson mentioned there's a small house for rent on 3rd East, Hannah told Margaret one evening as they prepared for bed in their shared room. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a small parlor. The rent is reasonable, and it's within walking distance of both the school and my shop. That sounds promising, Margaret agreed. Shall we look at it tomorrow after my classes finish? Hannah nodded, then gave her sister a sidelong glance. Tomorrow's Thursday, isn't it? Margaret pretended not to understand the significance. Yes, I believe it is. Every other Thursday, he said, Hannah pressed, her eyes twinkling. The Livestock Commission meets every other Thursday. Hannah Porter, I do not have Henry Thornton's schedule memorized, Margaret protested, though in truth, she was perfectly aware that tomorrow was indeed one of Henry's regular days in town. In the 3 weeks since their arrival, she hadn't seen him once, though not for lack of subtle inquiries about his whereabouts. Of course not, Hannah agreed with exaggerated innocence. Just as you don't happen to find errands that take you past the town hall every other Thursday afternoon. Margaret threw a pillow at her sister, who caught it with a laugh. Admit it, Hannah persisted. You miss him. Margaret sighed, relenting. I do, she confessed quietly, which is ridiculous considering how briefly we knew each other. It's not the length of time that matters, Hannah said, suddenly serious. It's the connection. Anyone could see there was something special between you two. Perhaps, Margaret allowed, but he hasn't sought me out either, has he? He knows where to find us. Hannah considered this. Men can be peculiar about these things. Perhaps he's waiting for some sign that his attentions would be welcome. Or perhaps I've romanticized a simple act of kindness, Margaret suggested pragmatically. He rescued 2 stranded women, as any decent man would. That doesn't mean he harbors any particular interest in me. Hannah looked unconvinced, but let the matter drop. Well, regardless, let's look at that house tomorrow. If it's suitable, we could move in by the end of the month. The house on 3rd East proved to be even better than described, small but well built, with a covered front porch and a tiny backyard where a few fruit trees were just beginning to blossom in the early spring sunshine. The landlord, impressed by Margaret's position as the town's teacher and Hannah's growing reputation as a seamstress, agreed to rent it to them with minimal advance payment. "We'll take it," Margaret told him decisively, her spirits lifted by this tangible sign of their successful fresh start. As they left the house, paperwork completed and keys in hand, Hannah suddenly gripped her sister's arm. "Maggie, look, isn't that?" Margaret followed her gaze down the street toward the town center. A tall, broad-shouldered figure in a tan hat was just emerging from the town hall, accompanied by several other men. Even at a distance, she recognized Henry immediately. Her heart performed a familiar flutter and she instinctively smoothed her hair, wishing she'd worn her newer dress instead of the practical blue cotton she'd chosen for a day of teaching and house hunting. "Go on," Hannah urged, giving her a gentle push. "Go say hello." "We can't just," Margaret began, but Hannah was already waving vigorously. "Mr. Thornton, Henry," she called, loud enough to draw the attention of several passers-by. Henry turned at the sound of his name, scanning the street until he spotted them. Even from a distance, Margaret could see his face brighten with recognition. He said something to his companions, then strode purposefully in their direction. "You're welcome," Hannah whispered smugly, earning a withering look from Margaret just before Henry reached them. "Miss Porter, Miss Hannah," he greeted them, removing his hat. What a pleasant surprise. Up close, Margaret could see that the past weeks had treated him well. His face was tanned from outdoor work, his blue eyes as striking as she remembered. He wore a clean white shirt under a brown vest, with a string tie at his collar, his town clothes, she surmised, a step up from the working attire he'd worn at the ranch. "Mr. Thornton," Margaret replied, aiming for composure despite her racing pulse. "How nice to see you again." "We were just securing a house to rent," Hannah volunteered cheerfully. "Right down the street there with the blue shutters." "The old Peterson place," Henry nodded. "That's a fine house, solid construction." "You know it?" Margaret asked. "I know most properties in the county," he explained. "Comes with serving on the tax assessment board." He glanced between the sisters. "Does this mean you're settling in well then?" "Very well," Hannah confirmed. "Margaret has 20 pupils already, and I've more sewing orders than I can manage alone." Henry's gaze settled on Margaret, warm with what appeared to be genuine pleasure at her success. "That's wonderful news. The children are fortunate to have such a teacher." Margaret felt herself blushing at the simple compliment. "Thank you. They're bright children, eager to learn." "The facilities are somewhat limited, but the school committee is making progress on plans for a proper schoolhouse," Henry interrupted. "In fact, that's partly what today's meeting was about. The funds have been approved and construction should begin within the month." "That's excellent news," Margaret said, genuinely pleased. An awkward silence descended, broken when Hannah suddenly exclaimed, "Oh, I just remembered I promised Charlotte I'd help her with something at her house right now." She took a step back. "Margaret, you don't mind walking home alone, do you? Or perhaps Mr. Thornton could escort you." Margaret gave her sister a look that promised future retribution for such transparent matchmaking, but Hannah merely smiled innocently and turned to Henry. "If you wouldn't mind, Mr. Thornton." "It's not far, but a lady shouldn't walk unaccompanied, even in St. George," Henry, looking somewhat bemused by Hannah's abrupt departure but not at all displeased by the suggested arrangement, nodded. "It would be my honor, Miss Porter." "Wonderful." "Margaret, I'll see you at supper," Hannah called, already walking briskly in the direction of Charlotte's house. "Lovely to see you again, Mr. Thornton." As Hannah disappeared around a corner, Margaret sighed. "I apologize for my sister. Subtlety has never been her strong suit." Henry chuckled, a deep, pleasant sound that made Margaret's heart skip. "No apology necessary. I'm grateful for the opportunity." He offered his arm. "Shall we?" As they walked slowly toward Charlotte's house, Margaret was acutely aware of the curious glances they received from townspeople. St. George was small enough that their promenade together would certainly fuel gossip. "How is Silver Creek?" she asked, seeking safe conversational ground. "And Mrs. Gunderson?" "Both thriving," Henry replied. The spring calving went well, 32 healthy new additions to the herd, and Mrs. Gunderson has been experimenting with cheese making with surprising success. That's wonderful, Margaret said sincerely. Your ranch seemed like such a peaceful place. Henry glanced down at her, something unreadable in his expression. It is, though it's been quieter since your visit. The implication that he might have missed their company, her company, sent a pleasant warmth through Margaret's chest. Before she could formulate a response, they were interrupted by a call from across the street. Mr. Thornton, just the man I wanted to see. A portly gentleman in a black suit hurried toward them, waving enthusiastically. Henry's expression suggested he wasn't entirely pleased by the interruption, but he stopped politely. Judge Parker, he greeted the newcomer. Allow me to introduce Miss Margaret Porter, our town's new school teacher. Miss Porter, Judge William Parker, who presides over the Territorial Circuit Court. A pleasure, Miss Porter, the judge said, tipping his hat. I've heard fine things about your teaching from several parents. Thank you, Your Honor, Margaret replied, touched that her efforts had been noticed. Mr. Thornton, the judge continued, barely pausing for breath, about that water rights dispute with the Rawlins property, I've received the survey results, and I believe we need to reconsider the boundary line. Do you have time to review them now? I have the documents at my office. Henry hesitated, glancing at Margaret. Please, don't let me keep you from important business, she said quickly, understanding the significance of water rights in this arid region. It can wait until my next visit to town, Henry said firmly. I'm escorting Miss Porter home at present. The judge's eyebrows rose fractionally, and he looked between them with new interest. I see. Well, it's not urgent. Next week will do. He tipped his hat again. Miss Porter, a pleasure to make your acquaintance. Mr. Thornton, good day to you both. As the judge walked away, Margaret couldn't help asking, water rights dispute? Henry sighed. My creek forms part of the boundary with a neighboring ranch. The owner, Rawlins, believes the boundary should follow the creek's course from 10 years ago before a flood altered its path. I maintain the current course is the legal boundary. It's complicated and significant, I imagine, in a place where water is so precious, Margaret observed. Henry looked impressed by her understanding. Exactly. In this territory, water rights are often more valuable than the land itself. They resumed walking, and Margaret found herself wishing Charlotte's house was farther away to prolong their time together. All too soon, they arrived at the familiar white house with green shutters. Thank you for the escort, Margaret said as they paused at the gate. It was kind of you. My pleasure, Henry replied, seeming reluctant to end their conversation. After a moment's hesitation, he added, Margaret, I've been meaning to call on you properly, to see how you and your sister were settling in. We would have welcomed your visit, she said honestly. The truth is, he continued, his voice lower, I wasn't sure if such attention would be welcome. You have a new life here, new opportunities. I didn't want to presume. Margaret felt a surge of affection for this considerate man. Henry, she said gently, your attention would always be welcome. Something in his face softened, and he took a step closer. In that case, would you permit me to call on you this Sunday afternoon? Perhaps we could walk in the town gardens. I would like that very much, Margaret replied, her heart beating faster at the formal request, which represented his clear intent to court her. Henry's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. Excellent. Shall we say 2 o'clock? 2 o'clock, she confirmed, returning his smile. He took her hand then, his calloused palm warm against her skin, and bowed slightly over it in a gesture that was both courtly and earnest. Until Sunday then, Miss Porter. Until Sunday, Mr. Thornton, she replied, reluctantly withdrawing her hand as he released it. As Henry walked away, Margaret remained at the gate, watching his retreating figure. Only when he turned the corner did she enter the house, where she found not only Hannah waiting with barely contained curiosity, but Charlotte as well, both of them clearly having observed the entire exchange through the front window. Well, Hannah demanded the moment Margaret closed the door. Don't keep us in suspense. Margaret couldn't contain her smile any longer. He's calling on me Sunday afternoon. Her sister's squeal of delight and Charlotte's knowing smile told Margaret she wasn't the only one who thought Henry Thornton might be exactly what she needed in this new chapter of her life. Sunday afternoon arrived with agonizing slowness. Margaret found herself checking the small mantel clock in Charlotte's parlor so frequently that Hannah finally threatened to hide it. "He won't arrive any sooner for your staring at that clock," her sister pointed out reasonably. Margaret smoothed her dress for the dozenth time, her best one, a sage green cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs that complemented her hazel eyes. "I'm being ridiculous, aren't I?" "Completely," Hannah agreed cheerfully, "but it's lovely to see." At precisely 2 o'clock, a knock came at the front door. Margaret forced herself to count to 10 before moving to answer it, not wanting to appear too eager. Henry stood on the porch, hat in hand, wearing a clean dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. He'd had his hair trimmed, she noticed, and there was a small bunch of wildflowers in his free hand. "Miss Porter," he greeted her, his voice warm, "you look beautiful." "Thank you, Mr. Thornton," she replied, accepting the wildflowers with genuine pleasure. "These are lovely." "Desert mariposa," he explained. "They only bloom for a few weeks each spring." After placing the flowers in water and enduring knowing looks from both Hannah and Charlotte, Margaret took Henry's offered arm, and they set off for the town gardens, a modest but growing collection of native plants and imported specimens that the town's improvement committee maintained near the center of St. George. As they walked, conversation flowed easily between them. Henry asked thoughtful questions about her teaching, and Margaret found herself sharing both her hopes for her students and her frustrations with the limited resources. "The oldest boy, Thomas, is 17 and brilliant with mathematics," she explained as they strolled between beds of desert-adapted plants. "He should be preparing for university, but there are no advanced texts available here. I've written to my former colleagues in Boston, hoping they might send suitable materials." "That's commendable," Henry said. "Many teachers wouldn't take such initiative." "Education changed my life," Margaret replied simply. "I want the same opportunity for my students, regardless of where they live." Henry nodded, understanding in his eyes. "My own education was interrupted by the war. Afterward, I educated myself through reading whatever I could find. Some of the finest minds I've known never set foot in a formal classroom." "Like Mrs. Gunderson," Margaret suggested with a smile. Henry laughed. "Exactly like Mrs. Gunderson. That woman knows more about animal husbandry and herbal medicine than most doctors I've met." As they continued through the gardens, Henry greeted several townspeople by name, introducing Margaret to those she hadn't yet met. She noticed the respect with which everyone addressed him and the genuine warmth in their interactions. "You're well regarded here," she observed after an elderly couple had moved on, the woman having insisted on telling Margaret how Henry had rebuilt their barn roof after a storm. Henry looked somewhat embarrassed by the praise. "It's a small community, we help each other, that's all." "It's more than that," Margaret persisted. "They trust you." He was silent for a moment, then said quietly, "Trust is hard won out here, where a person's word and actions can mean the difference between survival and disaster. I try to be worthy of it." They had reached a small stone bench partially secluded by flowering bushes. Henry gestured to it. "Shall we rest a while?" As they sat, Margaret became acutely aware of their proximity. The bench wasn't large, and Henry's arm brushed against hers, sending a small thrill through her body. "Margaret," he began, his voice lower now that they were alone, "I hope you don't think me too forward, but I've been thinking about you a great deal since we met." Her heart quickened. "Have you?" He turned slightly to face her, his blue eyes intent. "I have. There's something about you, your courage, your determination, your kindness that I find." He paused, searching for the right word. "Compelling." Margaret felt her cheeks warm at the sincere compliment. "I've thought of you too, Henry," she admitted, "more than I probably should." A smile touched his lips. "I'm glad to hear it." He hesitated, then continued, "I know you've only just arrived in St. George, that you're still establishing yourself here. I wouldn't want to complicate that process, but I would very much like to continue seeing you if you're amenable." "I am," Margaret said simply, her voice steadier than she felt. The relief and pleasure that crossed his face was worth any risk of appearing too eager. Good, that's good. For a moment, Margaret thought he might kiss her, and a part of her hoped he would. But Henry was too much of a gentleman for such boldness on what was essentially their first proper outing together. Instead, he took her hand in his touch gentle yet reassuring. "I should warn you," he said, a hint of humor entering his voice, "that Mrs. Gunderson has been asking about you and your sister almost daily. I believe she's taken a particular interest in your welfare." Margaret laughed. "She's a formidable woman. I wouldn't want to disappoint her." "Nor would I," Henry agreed solemnly, though his eyes twinkled. "She's threatened to withhold her sourdough bread if I don't, and I quote, 'Stop mooning about and do something proper about that teacher lady.'" The image of the stern Norwegian housekeeper giving romantic advice to her employer made Margaret laugh even harder. "Well, we can't have you deprived of sourdough bread," she managed finally. "That would be tragic." "Catastrophic," Henry agreed, his own laughter joining hers. In that moment of shared mirth, something settled between them, a comfortable certainty that this was right, that they fit together in some fundamental way that defied the brevity of their acquaintance. As their laughter subsided, Henry's expression grew more serious. "There's something else I should tell you," he said. "I've been appointed to represent our county at the Territorial Assembly in Salt Lake City next month. I'll be gone for about 2 weeks. "Oh," Margaret said, trying to hide her disappointment at the thought of such a long separation when their courtship was just beginning. "That's an honor." "It is," Henry acknowledged, "and important work for the region, but the timing is—" He squeezed her hand gently. "Unfortunate." "We'll have time before you leave," Margaret pointed out, "and you'll return." "I will," he promised, "and I'd like to write to you while I'm away, if I may." The idea of receiving letters from him sent a pleasant warmth through her. "I'd like that very much." They sat in companionable silence for a few moments, still holding hands until the town clock chimed 3, reminding them of the passage of time. "Shall we continue our walk?" Henry suggested, reluctantly releasing her hand as they stood. For the next hour, they explored the rest of the gardens and then wandered along Main Street, stopping occasionally to admire items in shop windows or greet acquaintances. By the time they returned to Charlotte's house, Margaret felt as though she'd known Henry far longer than the few weeks of their actual acquaintance. At the gate, Henry turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "I've had a wonderful afternoon, Margaret." "As have I," she replied truthfully. "May I call on you again Wednesday evening, perhaps for supper at the hotel restaurant? Your sister would be welcome too, of course," he added hastily, mindful of propriety. "I'd be delighted," Margaret said, "though I suspect Hannah might suddenly remember a prior engagement." Henry's eyes crinkled with amusement. "Your sister does seem to have convenient memory lapses." "A family trait, apparently," Margaret replied, thinking of how Charlotte, too, had insisted she was far too busy to accompany them on their walk today. As if on cue, the curtain in the front window twitched, suggesting they were being observed. Henry noticed it too and chuckled. "I believe we have an audience," he murmured. "Always," Margaret sighed. With the knowledge that they were being watched, Henry limited his farewell to a respectful kiss on her hand and a warm smile. "Until Wednesday, Margaret." "Until Wednesday, Henry," she echoed, already looking forward to their next meeting. The weeks that followed established a pattern to their courtship. Henry visited St. George twice a week when possible, taking Margaret for walks, to church socials, and occasionally to dinner at the modest hotel restaurant. Hannah always declined to accompany them, despite Henry's polite invitations, claiming prior engagements with increasing implausibility. By mid-April, Margaret and Hannah had moved into their rented house on 3rd East, giving them more independence and privacy. Charlotte helped them furnish it with second-hand pieces supplemented by James's handcrafted additions, a bookshelf here, a side table there. The place quickly became a true home, with Margaret's books lining the shelves and fabric samples from Hannah's work adding splashes of color. On his visits, Henry often brought small, thoughtful gifts. A book Margaret had mentioned wanting to read, wildflower seeds for their small garden, a specially ordered bolt of fine silk for Hannah's sewing business. More precious than these material items, however, was the time they spent together, learning each other's stories, sharing hopes and dreams, building a foundation for something deeper than initial attraction. Margaret learned that Henry had grown up on a small farm in Ohio, the middle son of 5 children. His father had been strict but fair, teaching his sons the value of hard work and honest dealing. His mother, gentler in spirit, had instilled in him a love of reading and an appreciation for beauty, even in harsh surroundings. Henry, in turn, came to understand the depth of Margaret's grief for her parents and her fierce protectiveness toward Hannah. He admired her resilience in leaving behind everything familiar to build a new life in the frontier, and her dedication to her students, often spending her own meager salary on supplies they needed. All too soon, the time came for Henry's departure to Salt Lake City for the Territorial Assembly. The evening before he was to leave, he came to the Porter sisters' home for a farewell supper prepared by Margaret herself, a feat she approached with more determination than skill, though the results were thankfully edible. After the meal, Hannah tactfully retired to her bedroom with a new novel, leaving Margaret and Henry alone in the small parlor. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the room as they sat side by side on the modest sofa. "I'll miss you," Margaret admitted, breaking the silence that had fallen between them. 2 weeks seems a very long time. "For me as well," Henry agreed, taking her hand. His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm, sending shivers up her arm. "I've grown accustomed to seeing you regularly." "You'll write?" she asked, though he'd already promised to do so. "Every day, if I can," he assured her. "And I've asked Mrs. Gunderson to check on you and Hannah while I'm gone. She'll be coming to town next week with some of her cheese to sell at the market." Margaret smiled at his thoughtfulness. "We'll be fine, Henry, but thank you." He nodded, then reached into his jacket pocket. "I have something for you, a small token to remember me by while I'm away." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box covered in velvet. Margaret's breath caught, but when he opened it, she saw not a ring but a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a book, suspended on a fine chain. "It opens," Henry explained, demonstrating how the tiny clasp released to reveal minuscule pages inside. "I thought, given your love of books and teaching." "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, genuinely touched by the meaningful gift. "Thank you, Henry." He removed the necklace from its box. "May I?" At her nod, he moved behind her, carefully placing the chain around her neck and fastening the clasp. His fingers brushed the sensitive skin at the nape of her neck, lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary. When he returned to his seat beside her, his eyes were drawn to the pendant resting just below her collarbone. "It suits you," he said softly. Margaret touched the small silver book, already treasuring it for the thought behind the gift. "I'll wear it every day until you return," she promised. Their eyes met and held, and Margaret felt the air between them change, charged with unspoken feelings. Slowly, telegraphing his intentions to give her time to object, Henry leaned closer. Margaret's heart raced as she closed her eyes, anticipating the moment their lips would meet. His kiss was gentle at first, almost tentative, the kiss of a man who wanted to be certain his advances were welcome. When Margaret responded, one hand coming up to rest lightly on his chest, Henry deepened the kiss, his arm encircling her waist to draw her closer. Time seemed to slow as they shared this first intimate moment, the outside world fading away until there was only the two of them, connected in this most basic yet profound way. When they finally parted, Margaret felt slightly dizzy, her lips tingling from the contact. "I've wanted to do that since the day we met," Henry admitted, his voice rougher than usual. He kept his arm around her waist as if reluctant to let her go. "I'm glad you waited until now," Margaret replied softly. "It made it more special." Henry raised a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing gently across her lower lip. "Margaret, I know we haven't known each other long, but I want you to know that my intentions are serious. When I return from Salt Lake City, I hope, that is, I would like to speak with you about our future." The implication was clear, and Margaret's heart soared at this hint of a proposal to come. "I would welcome that conversation, Henry. The happiness that bloomed on his face was like sunrise breaking over the desert, transformative and beautiful. He kissed her again, more confidently this time, his hand sliding into her hair as he drew her closer. They might have continued, but a discreet cough from the hallway reminded them they weren't truly alone. Reluctantly separating, they turned to see Hannah standing in the doorway, an apologetic expression on her face. "I'm terribly sorry to interrupt," she said, not looking sorry at all, "but it's getting rather late, and I believe Mr. Thornton has an early start tomorrow." Henry cleared his throat, standing quickly and offering Margaret his hand to help her rise as well. "Miss Hannah is quite right. I should be on my way." At the door, with Hannah tactfully retreating to give them a moment of privacy for their goodbyes, Henry took both Margaret's hands in his. "2 weeks," he said. "I'll be back before you know it." "I'll hold you to that," Margaret replied, trying to keep her tone light despite the heaviness in her heart at their impending separation. He kissed her once more, briefly but with unmistakable feeling, before stepping back. "Until then, Margaret?" "Until then, Henry," she echoed, watching as he walked down the path to where his horse was tethered at the gate. He mounted with the easy grace of a man accustomed to riding, tipped his hat to her one last time, and rode away into the gathering darkness. Margaret stood in the doorway until he was out of sight, her fingers absently touching the silver book pendant that now seemed to carry the weight of promise. The days of Henry's absence stretched longer than Margaret had anticipated. Though she kept busy with her teaching duties, preparations for the new schoolhouse construction, and helping Hannah with the increasing demands of her sewing business, she found her thoughts constantly drifting to Henry. True to his word, letters arrived regularly delivered by the twice-weekly mail coach that connected St. George to the larger settlements northward. Henry wrote of the assembly proceedings, describing the political maneuverings and debates with a clarity that made them interesting even to someone unfamiliar with territorial governance. But it was the personal touches in his letters that Margaret treasured most. His observations of Salt Lake City's growing urban landscape compared to St. George's frontier character, his amusing accounts of interactions with other delegates, and, increasingly, expressions of his feelings for her that seemed easier for him to commit to paper than to say aloud. In her replies, Margaret shared news of her students' progress, Hannah's business developments, and the small daily occurrences that made up life in St. George. She described the spring wildflowers blooming in the desert, knowing he would appreciate the beauty of the landscape they both loved. And gradually, she allowed herself to be more open about her own developing feelings, finding freedom in the written word that sometimes eluded her in person. As Henry had promised, Mrs. Gunderson arrived in town the following week, bringing with her several wheels of cheese and a basket of fresh eggs. The housekeeper visited Margaret at the schoolroom during the midday break, inspecting the facilities with a critical eye and questioning Margaret closely about her living arrangements and well-being. "You are too thin," Mrs. Gunderson declared, pressing the basket of eggs into Margaret's hands. "Henry would not like it. You must eat more." Margaret couldn't help smiling at the woman's blunt concern. "I assure you, Mrs. Gunderson, I'm eating well. Teaching simply keeps me active," the housekeeper harumphed skeptically. "Nevertheless, eggs for strength and cheese. I will bring to your house later." True to her word, she appeared at the Porter sisters' home that evening, laden with not only cheese but also fresh bread, preserved fruits, and a jar of honey. Hannah, delighted by the unexpected bounty, insisted the housekeeper stay for supper, during which Mrs. Gunderson shared stories of her native Norway and her journey to America that had the sisters alternately fascinated and amused. As she prepared to leave, the older woman fixed Margaret with a penetrating look. "He misses you," she said simply. "Never have I seen him check for mail so often." The statement, delivered matter-of-factly, warmed Margaret's heart. "I miss him too," she admitted. Mrs. Gunderson nodded, satisfied. "Good life is too short for pretending otherwise." She patted Margaret's hand with surprising gentleness. "He is good man, best I know you are good for him." "Thank you, Mrs. Gunderson," Margaret said, touched by the woman's approval. "That means a great deal to me." The housekeeper gave a brisk nod. I return to ranch tomorrow. You need anything, send word. Henry has arranged with stagecoach driver to carry messages without charge. After Mrs. Gunderson's departure, Hannah turned to Margaret with a knowing smile. You've been approved by the formidable housekeeper, she observed. I believe that's a more significant hurdle than winning over any relative would be, Margaret laughed. She is rather intimidating, isn't she? But I like her very much. She clearly feels the same about you, Hannah replied, though I suspect her approval has more to do with how happy you make Henry than with any particular virtue of your own. Hannah, Margaret protested, though she couldn't help smiling at the thought. The second week of Henry's absence passed even more slowly than the first. Margaret found herself counting the days until his expected return, much as she had chided Hannah for similar behavior during their journey west. On the day before Henry was due back, Margaret was supervising her students' midday recess when an unfamiliar rider galloped into town, heading straight for the telegraph office. Something about the man's urgent manner caused a ripple of interest among the townspeople on the street. Margaret had just called her students back to their lessons when the door to the schoolroom burst open and James Miller appeared, his expression grave. "Margaret," he said, barely acknowledging the curious children, "you need to come with me. There's been news from Salt Lake City." Her heart plummeted. "Henry?" she asked, unable to form a more coherent question. James nodded grimly. "There was an incident. He's alive," he added quickly, seeing the color drain from her face, "but injured. They're bringing him home by wagon, should arrive tomorrow." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth, her mind racing with terrible possibilities. "How bad is it? What happened?" "Details are sketchy," James replied. "Something about an altercation after an assembly vote. He was apparently defending another delegate who was being threatened." Of course he was, Margaret thought. That was exactly the sort of man Henry was always stepping in to protect others, regardless of personal risk. "Charlotte's at your house now, explaining to Hannah," James continued. "I'll take over your class for the remainder of the day. You should go home and prepare." Margaret nodded numbly, gathering her shawl and reticule with hands that suddenly seemed disconnected from her body. James squeezed her shoulder supportively as she passed him. "He's strong, Margaret," he said quietly, "and he has something to live for now. That makes all the difference." The next 24 hours passed in an agony of waiting. Margaret and Hannah prepared their small home as best they could, converting the parlor into a sick room since their modest bedrooms were upstairs and would be difficult for an injured man to access. Charlotte arrived with extra bedding and medical supplies, while several other townswomen brought food and offered assistance. Word of Henry's injury spread quickly through the small community, and by morning it seemed all of St. George was invested in his welfare. The town doctor, an elderly man named Peterson, stopped by to inform Margaret he would be ready when the wagon arrived. "I served as a field surgeon during the war," he assured her. "Whatever the injury, we'll see him through it." Margaret clasped the doctor's hand gratefully, finding comfort in the community's response. Henry might not have family in St. George, but he was far from alone. It was mid-afternoon when the shout went up that a wagon was approaching from the north road. Margaret, who had been restlessly pacing the front porch, ran to the gate, straining to see through the dust kicked up by the approaching vehicle. The wagon moved slowly, carefully negotiating the uneven road. As it drew closer, Margaret could make out two figures on the driver's bench, neither of them Henry. Her heart constricted as she realized he must be lying in the wagon bed, too injured to sit up. When the wagon finally reached their house, Margaret recognized one of the men as the telegraph operator from Salt Lake City. The other, a stocky man with a bushy beard, was unfamiliar to her. "Miss Porter," the telegraph operator called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "We've brought Mr. Thornton, as requested." Margaret hurried forward as the bearded man jumped down from the bench and moved to the back of the wagon. "How is he?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Stubborn as a mule," came a familiar voice from the wagon bed. "And perfectly capable of speaking for himself." Margaret's knees nearly buckled with relief as Henry's face appeared, pale and drawn with a vivid bruise on one cheekbone, but unmistakably alert. He was sitting up, though with evident difficulty, his left arm secured in a makeshift sling across his chest. "Henry," she exclaimed, rushing to the back of the wagon, "they said you were badly injured." "Exaggerated reports," he replied, though the tightness around his eyes belied his casual tone. "Though I wouldn't object to your assistance getting down from this infernal wagon, the ride hasn't been particularly comfortable." With the help of the two men, Henry managed to climb down from the wagon, wincing as the movement jostled his injured arm. Now standing, Margaret could see the extent of the visible damage. Beyond the bruised face and immobilized arm, he moved stiffly, suggesting further injuries to his ribs or back, and there was a bandage visible at the edge of his hairline. "What happened?" she asked, supporting him as they slowly made their way to the house, where Hannah and Charlotte waited anxiously. "Political disagreement that turned physical," Henry explained tersely. "Nothing worth dwelling on," the bearded man snorted. "That's putting it mildly." Three men cornered Delegate Wilson in an alley after he voted against their mining interests. Thornton here stepped in and took a beating meant for Wilson, including a knife to the shoulder. Would have been worse if some passers-by hadn't heard the commotion. Margaret gasped, her arm tightening around Henry's waist. "A knife, Henry, they could have killed you." "But they didn't," he pointed out, his good arm around her shoulders as they navigated the front steps. "I'm here and I'll heal, that's what matters." Dr. Peterson was waiting inside, directing Henry to the makeshift sick in the parlor. After insisting that Margaret and Hannah step out to give him privacy for the examination, the doctor spent nearly half an hour assessing Henry's injuries, occasionally asking questions in a low voice. When he finally emerged, closing the parlor door behind him, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "The knife wound is clean and has been well tended, no sign of infection. It missed anything vital but did some damage to the muscle. His ribs are bruised but not broken, and the head wound is superficial. With proper rest and care, he should recover fully, though the arm will take time to regain its strength." Margaret sagged with relief. "Thank you, doctor. Can I see him now?" Briefly, the doctor allowed. "He needs rest more than anything. I've given him something for the pain that may make him drowsy." He handed Margaret a small bottle of pills. "One every 6 hours if the pain is severe, but no more than that. I'll return tomorrow to change the bandages and check for any signs of infection." Hannah stepped forward. "I'll show the doctor out, Maggie. Go on." With a grateful nod to her sister, Margaret entered the parlor. Henry was lying on the bed they'd prepared, his shirt removed and replaced with fresh bandages wrapped around his upper chest and left shoulder. His eyes were closed, and for a moment she thought he might already be asleep. "Margaret?" His voice was tired but aware as his eyes opened to seek her out. "I'm here," she assured him, moving to sit carefully on the edge of the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I lost an argument with a stampeding bull," he admitted with a weak smile. "But better now that I'm here with you." Margaret took his uninjured hand, squeezing it gently. "You frightened me," she confessed, "when James said you'd been hurt." "I'm sorry for worrying you," Henry said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "It wasn't how I planned to return." "No, I imagine not," Margaret replied, attempting a light tone despite the tears threatening to spill. "Though it is quite dramatic, Hannah will have much to gossip about." That drew a chuckle from him, followed immediately by a wince. "Please don't make me laugh," my ribs protest. "Sorry," she said contritely. She hesitated, then asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "Henry, what really happened? The full truth, please." He sighed, closing his eyes briefly. "It was much as your friend described. The assembly voted down a proposal that would have allowed a mining company to circumvent water usage restrictions. Wilson cast the deciding vote. Afterward, as we were walking back to our lodgings, 3 men company employees, I suspect, confronted him. Things escalated quickly." He shrugged his good shoulder. "I couldn't stand by and watch them harm him." "Of course you couldn't," Margaret said softly. It was precisely this protective instinct that had led him to ride back for 2 stranded sisters on a lonely trail. "Were they arrested?" 2 were, Henry confirmed. "The 3rd escaped in the confusion. The territorial marshal is investigating, but—" He trailed off, his eyelids growing heavy. Rest now, Margaret urged, seeing the medication beginning to take effect. We can talk more later. Don't leave, he asked, his voice slurring slightly as the painkiller pulled him toward sleep. I'll be right here, she promised, settling more comfortably beside him, still holding his hand. As Henry drifted into sleep, Margaret studied his face, noting the new lines of pain etched there. A profound feeling of tenderness washed over her, followed by the startling realization that what she felt for this man had deepened into something more significant than affection or attraction. Somewhere amid their letters, conversations, and shared moments, she had fallen in love with Henry Thornton. The knowledge settled in her heart with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Whatever challenges lay ahead in his recovery, she would face them by his side. The following days established a routine centered around Henry's care. Dr. Peterson visited daily at first, then every other day as the wounds began to heal cleanly. Margaret adjusted her teaching schedule, conducting morning classes only and arranging for an older student to supervise afternoon exercises so she could tend to Henry. Hannah took over household duties with unexpected competence, preparing meals and keeping the house running smoothly while still managing her sewing business. Charlotte visited regularly, bringing fresh produce from her garden and news from town. After the first 3 days, Henry insisted on moving back to the ranch, arguing that he was imposing on the sisters' hospitality and limited space. Margaret, supported by Dr. Peterson, flatly refused to consider it. "You can barely walk to the outhouse without assistance," she pointed out bluntly. "How do you propose to manage at the ranch, Mrs. Gunderson?" he began. "Is an excellent housekeeper but not a nurse," Margaret interrupted, "and she has the ranch to run in your absence. You're staying here until Dr. Peterson says otherwise." The firmness in her voice surprised even herself, but Henry merely sighed in resignation. "Yes, madam," he murmured, a hint of amusement in his eyes despite his discomfort. As the days passed, Henry's strength gradually returned. The knife wound in his shoulder began to heal, though Dr. Peterson warned it would leave a significant scar. By the end of the second week, he was able to sit up for longer periods and even venture onto the front porch on mild days, where he would read or simply watch the street life of St. George, often with Margaret beside him during her free hours. It was during one such afternoon, with Hannah away at her shop and the house quiet around them, that Henry finally raised the subject they'd both been avoiding. "Margaret," he began, setting aside the book he'd been attempting to read, "there's something we need to discuss." She looked up from her mending, recognizing the seriousness in his tone. "What is it, Henry?" He shifted in his chair to face her more directly, wincing slightly at the movement. "These past weeks, having you care for me, it's made me realize something important." Margaret set her sewing aside, her heart beginning to race. "Oh, and what's that?" "That I don't want to return to Silver Creek alone," he said simply. "That my home isn't complete without you in it." Her breath caught as Henry reached for her hand with his good one. "I had planned to do this differently," he continued, his blue eyes intent on hers. "I had thought to court you properly for a few more months, to take you to dinner at that new restaurant in Cedar City, perhaps buy a ring in Salt Lake City. But nearly dying has a way of clarifying what's truly important." "Henry," Margaret whispered, barely daring to hope where this was leading. "I love you, Margaret Porter," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his expression. "I think I began falling in love with you the moment I saw you standing in the dust of that trail, protecting your sister with a derringer that probably wouldn't have stopped a determined jackrabbit." A laugh escaped her at the memory, though tears were gathering in her eyes. "You're the bravest, most compassionate woman I've ever known," Henry continued. "And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my life with you. Will you marry me, Margaret? Will you make Silver Creek your home and me the happiest man in Utah Territory?" The tears spilled over then, running unchecked down Margaret's cheeks. "Yes," she managed through the emotion tightening her throat. "Yes, Henry Thornton, I will marry you." Joy transformed his face, erasing the lingering signs of pain and fatigue. With their hands still joined, he leaned forward carefully, mindful of his healing injuries, and kissed her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the depth of his feelings. When they parted, Margaret couldn't help asking, "What about my teaching?" The school year isn't over yet, and the new schoolhouse is just being completed. Henry smiled, touching her cheek gently. "I would never ask you to give up something that matters so much to you. We can work out arrangements. Perhaps you could continue teaching until a replacement is found, or even longer if you wish. Silver Creek isn't so far that you couldn't ride in with me on my regular visits to town." The consideration behind his words only confirmed what Margaret already knew, that this was a man who saw her as a true partner, not merely a possession or an accessory to his life. "Thank you," she said softly, "for understanding what it means to me. Always," he promised. The sound of the front door opening announced Hannah's return, followed by her voice calling out, "Maggie, are you home?" "In the parlor," Margaret called back, hastily wiping away her tears though unable to stop smiling. Hannah appeared in the doorway, her arms full of fabric samples. "I've been thinking about curtains for the kitchen window," she stopped abruptly, taking in their clasped hands and Margaret's tear-streaked face. "What's happened? Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Margaret assured her. "Henry has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes." Hannah's squeal of delight was so piercing that Henry winced, though he was smiling broadly as she dropped her fabric samples and rushed forward to embrace them both gently in Henry's case, mindful of his injuries. "Finally," she exclaimed. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you two in the root cellar to make it happen." "Hannah," Margaret protested, laughing. "Well, it was painfully obvious to everyone else," her sister maintained. "Even Mrs. Gunderson said so when she visited last week. She told me you two were, and I quote, too stubborn to see what was right in front of your noses." Henry chuckled. "She's not known for mincing words." "When will the wedding be?" Hannah asked eagerly. "Where will you live? Have you told Charlotte yet? Oh, there's so much to plan." "Hannah, slow down," Margaret laughed. "We've only just become engaged. We haven't discussed any details yet." "Actually," Henry interjected, "I do have some thoughts on that if you're amenable." Margaret turned to him, curious. "Go on." "I was thinking perhaps a June wedding," he suggested. "By then, the school year will be over, I should be fully recovered, and the weather will be pleasant. As for where we'll live..." He hesitated, looking between the sisters. "I had hoped you would both come to Silver Creek. There's plenty of room, and Hannah could continue her sewing business from there. Many of the neighboring ranches have wives and daughters who would value her skills." Hannah's eyes widened. "You want me to come too?" "Of course," Henry said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You're Margaret's sister. You belong together. And," he added with a warm smile, "I've grown rather fond of you myself in a brotherly way." Margaret felt her heart swell with love for this man who so instinctively understood what mattered to her. "Are you sure, Henry?" "It's a significant change for your household. Silver Creek has always been meant to be a family home," he replied simply. "It just took me a while to find the right family to fill it." The word family hung in the air between them, rich with promise for the future they would build together, not just the two of them, but Hannah as well, and perhaps someday, God willing, children of their own. As Hannah excitedly began listing all the preparations that would be needed for a June wedding, Margaret caught Henry's gaze over her sister's head. The love she saw reflected there matched the feeling overflowing in her own heart, a love born in the wilderness when a cowboy rode back for two stranded sisters and said, "Come with me." 3 years later, the September sun cast long shadows across Silver Creek Ranch as Margaret Thornton stood on the wide front porch, watching the approaching wagon with a smile on her face. Beside her, Henry bounced their 10-month-old son, William James, on his hip, the boy's chubby hands reaching toward his father's hat with determined concentration. "They're here." 8-year-old Thomas Cooper called excitedly, racing past Margaret to the edge of the porch. The boy, one of Margaret's former pupils from St. George, had come to live with them last year after his parents died in a fire. Henry and Margaret hadn't hesitated to open their home to the bright, mathematically gifted child who had no other family. The wagon pulled up to the hitching post, and Hannah waved from the driver's seat, her husband Daniel beside her. They had been married just 6 months earlier, after a courtship that began when Daniel Stevens, a former Pony Express rider turned horse breeder, came to Silver Creek to purchase stock from Henry. The attraction between him and Hannah had been immediate and mutual, culminating in a Christmas wedding that had filled the ranch house with joy and celebration. "Welcome home," Margaret called as Daniel helped Hannah down from the wagon. "How was the trip to Salt Lake City?" "Productive," Hannah replied, embracing her sister warmly before reaching for her nephew with a delighted smile. "And we've brought surprises for everyone." While Daniel and Henry unloaded the wagon, chatting easily about ranch matters, Hannah produced gifts for Thomas and little William, a book of mathematics puzzles for the older boy and a carved wooden horse for the baby. For Margaret, she had brought fabric for new curtains and a collection of seeds from an experimental garden in Salt Lake City. "The head gardener assured me these varieties should thrive in our climate," Hannah explained as they moved inside to the large kitchen where Mrs. Gunderson was preparing supper. The housekeeper greeted the returning couple with her characteristic blend of gruffness and affection, accepting the special tea mixture Hannah had obtained specifically for her with a pleased harumph. The evening passed pleasantly as they shared a hearty meal and exchanged news. Hannah's sewing business had expanded to include not only custom garments, but also the design and production of practical riding attire for women, which was gaining popularity throughout the territory. Daniel's horse breeding operation, now sharing space and resources with Silver Creek, was developing a reputation for quality stock. After supper, as the men retired to the study to discuss some business matter and Mrs. Gunderson took Thomas to the pantry to help prepare bread dough for the morning, Margaret and Hannah sat together in the comfortable parlor. William had fallen asleep in Margaret's arms, his peaceful face illuminated by the warm lamplight. "He grows more like Henry every day," Hannah observed softly, reaching out to stroke her nephew's downy head. "Those blue eyes." Margaret smiled, gazing down at her son with boundless love. "But he has father's chin, don't you think, and mother's musical laugh." "Yes," Hannah agreed, a touch of wistfulness in her voice. "They would have adored him." Margaret nodded, the familiar pang of missing their parents muted now by time and the fullness of her present happiness. "I still think of them every day. I want William to know them through our stories, even if he never had the chance to meet them." "We'll make sure of it," Hannah promised, then added with a mischievous smile, "and perhaps soon he'll have a cousin to share those stories with." Margaret looked up sharply, studying her sister's face. "Hannah Porter Stevens, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Hannah's smile widened as she nodded, her hands moving instinctively to rest on her still flat stomach. "Daniel doesn't know yet I wanted you to be the first. The doctor in Salt Lake City confirmed it yesterday. We're expecting a baby in the spring." With a careful movement so as not to disturb William, Margaret reached for her sister's hand, squeezing it tightly. "Oh, Hannah, that's wonderful news. Daniel will be ecstatic." "I hope so," Hannah said, though her glowing expression suggested she had little doubt of her husband's reaction. "I'm planning to tell him tonight." Margaret felt tears of joy gathering in her eyes. "Our family keeps growing," she said softly. "When I think of where we were that day the wagon train left us behind." "Stranded and terrified," Hannah finished with a soft laugh. "Who could have imagined this would be our life now?" Margaret's gaze drifted to the window, through which she could see Silver Creek itself glimmering in the moonlight, the water that gave the ranch its name flowing steadily just as it had the day Henry first brought them here. Beyond it lay the grazing lands where their cattle thrived, the new barn where Daniel's horses were stabled, the orchards they'd planted, and the vegetable gardens that now supplied much of their food year-round. From the study came the sound of men's laughter, Henry's deep chuckle, and Daniel's lighter tone blending in companionable mirth. From the kitchen, she could hear Mrs. Gunderson instructing Thomas in the proper way to knead dough, the boy's eager questions punctuated by the housekeeper's patient answers. And in her arms, William slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge, even at his young age, that he was surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally. No, Margaret agreed, returning her attention to her sister. I could never have imagined this life, but I wouldn't change a single step of the journey that brought us here. Later that night, as she and Henry prepared for bed in their comfortable room overlooking the creek, Margaret shared Hannah's news while Henry brushed out her long hair, a nightly ritual that had begun during their honeymoon and continued ever since. "Daniel will make an excellent father," Henry commented, running the brush gently through her chestnut locks. "He has a natural patience that children respond to. I've seen it with Thomas." "Like someone else I know," Margaret replied, turning to smile at her husband. The injuries from the assault 3 years ago had healed completely, though he occasionally felt twinges in his shoulder during cold weather. Otherwise, he was as strong and vital as ever, his face perhaps more weathered from working outdoors, but his blue eyes just as bright and keen. "I had good teachers," Henry said modestly, setting the brush aside. "My father, for all his strictness, always made time to answer my questions. I try to do the same for Thomas, and William when he's old enough to ask them." Margaret rose from her dressing table and moved to join him on the edge of the bed. "You're a wonderful father, Henry. I knew you would be, even before William was born." He slipped an arm around her waist, drawing her closer. "And you are an exceptional mother. Watching you with William, with Thomas, it's one of my greatest joys." Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. "Do you ever think about that day on the trail, when you came back for us?" Henry was quiet for a moment, his hand tracing gentle patterns on her back. "Often," he admitted. "It was one of the best decisions I ever made. Second only to proposing," she teased, tilting her face up to his. "Actually," he said with a slow smile, "I think of them as part of the same decision, the decision to follow my heart, even when it led me in an unexpected direction." Margaret reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "I'm glad you did." "So am I," Henry murmured, bending to kiss her with the same tenderness that still made her heart race after 3 years of marriage. "So am I." As the kiss deepened, Margaret gave thanks once again for the twist of fate that had left her and Hannah stranded in the wilderness, and for the cowboy who rode back and said, "Come with me," changing all their lives forever. Outside, Silver Creek continued its eternal journey through the ranch that bore its name, its waters reflecting the countless stars overhead, witnesses to the love that had found its home in this once lonely valley, a love that would endure through all the seasons yet to come.